Hey YouTube, so for tonight we're going to be doing something a little bit new. I'm going to be reading from one of my favorite authors, Mavis Gallant. I'm going to be reading one of her favorite stories from the 15th District. It's a little bit of a kooky story, I guess you could say. Anyways, I found out about it first from Karen Russell on the New Yorker podcast. So if you guys would like to hear another reading, probably a lot better than mine, please feel free to go over there and check it out. She's also a great author herself that I insist everyone take the time to read. So, without further ado, here we go. From the 15th District by Mavis Gallant. Although an epidemic of haunting widely reported spread through the 15th District of our city last summer, only 3 acceptable complaints were lodged with the police. Major Emery Travella, 31st Infantry, 1914 to 18. Order of the Leopard. Military Beech Leaf, Cross of St. Lambert First Class, killed while defusing a bomb in a civilian area 9, June 1941. Medal of Dancing, posthumous. Claims he is haunted by the entire congregation of St. Michael and all the angels on Bartholomew Street. Every year on the Sunday following the nearest anniversary of his death, Major Travella attends Holy Communion service at St. Michael's, the church from which he was buried. He stands at the back close to the doors, waiting until all the communicants have returned to their places before he approaches the altar rail. His intention is to avoid the mixed queue of dead and living, the thought of which is disgusting to him. The congregation sits hushed and expectant, straining to hear Major's footsteps. He drags one foot a little. After receiving the house, the Major leaves at once, without waiting for the blessing. For the past several years, the Major has noticed that the congregation doubles in size as 9 June approaches. Some of these strangers bring cameras and tape recorders with them. Others burn incense under the pews and wave amulets and trinkets in what they imagine to be his direction, muttering pagan gibberish all the while. References he is sure must be meant for him are worked into the sermons. And he that was dead sat up and began to speak, Luke 7:15, or so Job died, being old and full of days, Job 42:17. The Major points out that he never speaks and never opens his mouth except for to receive Holy Communion. He lived about 16,060 days, many of which he does not remember. On 23 September 1914, as a young private, he was crucified to a cartwheel for 5 hours for having failed to salute an equally young lieutenant. One ankle was left permanently impaired. The Major wishes the congregation to leave him in peace. The opacity of the living, their heaviness and dullness, the moisture of their skin, and the dustiness of their hair are repellent to a man of feeling. It was always his habit to avoid civilian crowds. He lived for 6 years on the 4th floor in Block E, Stoneflower Gardens, without saying a word to his neighbors or even attempting to learn their names. An affidavit can easily be obtained from the former porter at the gardens, now residing at the Institute for Victims of Senile Trauma, 15th District. Miss Ibrahim, age 37, mother of 12 children, complains about being haunted by Dr. L. Chamberlain of Regis Hospital, 7th District, and by Miss Alicia Forenbach, social investigator from the Welfare Bureau, 15th District. These two haunt Miss Ibrahim without reprise, presenting for her ratification and approval conflicting and unpleasant versions of her own death. According to Dr. Chamberlain's account, soon after Miss Ibrahim was charged as incurable from Regis Hospital, he paid his patient a professional call. He arrived at the 4:15 on the first Tuesday of April, expecting to find the social investigator with whom he had a firm appointment. Miss Ibrahim was discovered alone in a windowless room, the walls of which were coated with whitish fungus, a quarter of an inch thick, which rose to the height of about 40 inches from the floor. Dr. Chamberlain inquired, "Where's the social investigator?" Mrs. Ibrahim pointed to her throat, reminding him that she could not reply. Several dark-eyed children peeped into the room and ran away. "How many are yours?" the doctor asked. Miss Ibrahim indicated 6 twice with her fingers. Where do they sleep? Said the doctor. Miss Ibrahim indicated the floor. Dr. Chamilton said, What does your husband do for a living? Mrs. Ibrahim pointed to the workbench on which the doctor saw several pieces of finely wrought jewelry. He thought it a waste that skilled work had been lavished on what seemed to be plastics and base metals. Dr. Chamilton made the patient as comfortable as he could, explaining that he could not administer drugs for the relief of pain until the social investigator had signed a receipt for them. Miss Forenbach arrived at 5 o'clock. It had taken her 40 minutes to find a suitable parking space. The street appeared to be poor, but everyone living on it owned 1 or 2 cars. Dr. Chamilton, who was angry at having been kept waiting, declared he would not be responsible for the safety of his patients in a room filled with mold. Miss Forenbach had restored that the district could not resettle a family of 14 persons who were foreign-born, when there was a long list of native citizens waiting for accommodation. Mrs. Ibrahim had in any case relinquished her right to a domicile in the 15th district, the day she lost consciousness in the road and allowed an ambulance to transport her to the hospital in the 7th. It was up to the hospital to look after her now. Dr. Chamilton pointed out that the housing of patients is not the business of the hospitals. It was well known that the foreign poor preferred to crowd together in the 15th, where they could sing and dance in the streets and attend one another's weddings. Miss Forenbach declared that Mrs. Ibrahim could easily have moved her bed into the kitchen, which was somewhat warmer and which boasted a window. When Mrs. Ibrahim died, the children would be placed in foster homes, eliminating the need for a larger apartment. Dr. Chamilton remembers Mrs. Forenbach crying, "Oh, why do all these people come here, where nobody wants them?" While he was trying to think of an answer, Mrs. Ibrahim died. In her testimony, Miss Forenbach recalls that she had to beg and plead with Dr. Chamilton to visit Miss Ibrahim, who had been discharged from Regis Hospital without medicines or prescriptions or advice or instructions. Miss Forenbach had returned several times that April day to see if the doctor had arrived. The first thing Dr. Chamilton said on entering the room was, "There is no way of helping these people. Even the simplest rules of hygiene are too complicated for them to follow. Wherever they settle, they spread disease and vermin. They have been responsible for outbreaks, apathis, steromatis, hereditary hypoxia, kychodromalocalus, gonorrheal arthritis, and sclerodoma." I'm trying my best on those words. "Their eating habits are filthy. They never wash their hands. The virus that attacks them breeds in dirt. We took the patient against all rules after the ambulance driver left her laying in the courtyard and drove off without asking for a receipt. Regis Hospital was built and endowed for ailing Greek scholars. Now it is crammed with the unteachable persons who cannot read or write." His cheeks and forehead were flushed, his speech incoherent and blurred. According to the social investigator, he was the epitome of broken down. Irresponsible old rascals in the 7th district employees in its public services. Wondering at the effect of this ranting of his might have on the patient, Miss Forenbach glanced at Mrs. Ibrahim and noticed that she had died. Mrs. Ibrahim's version of her death has the social investigator arriving first, bringing Mrs. Ibrahim a present of wine-colored dressing gown made of soft quilted silk. Miss Forenbach explained that the gown was part of the donation of garments to the needy. Large plastic bags decorated with moss rose, the emblem of the 15th district, and bearing the words, "Clean clothes for the foreign-born," had been distributed by volunteer workers in the more prosperous streets of the district. A few citizens kept the bags as souvenirs, but most had turned them into the welfare bureau filled with attractive clothing, washed, ironed, and mended, with the missing buttons replaced. Miss Ibrahim sat up and put on the dressing gown, and the social investigator helped her button it. Then Miss Forenbach changed the bed linen and pulled the bed away from the wall. She sat down and took Mrs. Ibrahim's hand in hers and spoke out a new sunny flat, containing 5 warm rooms, with which would soon be available. Miss Fornbroch said that arrangements had been made for her to send the 12 Ibrahim children to their mountains for special winter classes. They would be taught history and languages, and would learn to ski. The doctor arrived soon after. He stopped and spoke to Mr. Ibrahim, who was sitting at his workbench making an emerald patch box. The doctor said to him, "If you give me your Social Security papers, I can attend to the medical insurance. It will save you a great deal of trouble." Mr. Ibrahim answered, "What is Social Security?" The doctor examined the patch box and asked Mr. Ibrahim what he earned. Mr. Ibrahim told him, and the doctor said, "But that is less than minimum wage." Mr. Ibrahim said, "What is minimum wage?" The doctor turned to Miss Fornbroch, saying, "We really must try to help them." Mrs. Ibrahim died. Mr. Ibrahim, when he understood that nothing could be done, lay face down on the floor, weeping loudly. Then he remembers the rules of hospitality, got up, gave each of the guests a present. Miss Fornbroch a belt made of Syriac coins, a copy of which is in the Cairo Museum, and for a doctor, a bracelet of precious metals engraved with pomegranates, about 16 pomegranates in all, that has life-saving properties. Mrs. Ibrahim asked that her account of the afternoon be registered with the police as true version, and that copies be sent to the doctor and the social investigator with a courteous request for peace and silence. Last complaint. Miss Carlotte Essling, née Holmquist, complains about being haunted by her husband, Professor Augustus Essling, the philosopher and historian. When they were married, the former Miss Holmquist was 17. Professor Essling, a widower, had 4 small children. He explained to Miss Holmquist why he wanted to marry again. He said, "I must have one person, preferably female, of whom I can depend on absolutely, who will never betray me, even in her thoughts. A disloyal thought revealed, a betrayal even in a fantasy, would be enough to destroy me. Knowing that I may rely upon some one person will leave me free to continue my work without anxiety or distraction." The work was Professor's lifelong examination of the philosopher Nicholas de Malebranche, for whom he had named his eldest child. "If I cannot have the unfailing loyalty I have described, I would as soon not marry at all," the professor added. He had just begun his work on Malebranche and materialism. Mrs. Essling recalls that at 17 this seemed entirely within her possibilities, and she replied with something like, "Yes, I see," or "I quite understand," or "You needn't mention it again." Mrs. Essling brought up her husband's 4 children and had 2 more of her own, and died after 36 years of marriage at the age of 53. Her husband haunts her without proof of her good. Her husband haunts her with proof of her goodness. He tells people that Mrs. Essling, was born an angel, lived like an angel, and is an angel in eternity. Mrs. Essling would like relief from this charge. Angel is a loose way of speaking. She is astonished that the professor cannot be more precise. Angels are created, not born. Nowhere in written testimony will you find a scrap of proof that angels are good. Some are merely messengers, others have parliamentary function. All are stupid. After her death, Mrs. Essling remained in the 15th district. She says she can go nowhere without being accosted by the professor, who, having completed the last phase of his work, Malebranche and mysticism, roams the streets looking for shopping windows, eating lunch twice in 2 different restaurants, telling his life story to the waitress and bus drivers. When he sees Mrs. Essling, he calls out, "There you are. And what have you been sent to tell me? Is there a message?" In July, catching sight of her at the open-air fruit markets in Duloc Street, the professor jumped off a bus. Upsetting barrels of plums and apricots, waving an umbrella as he ran. Mrs. Easling had to take refuge in the cold storage room of the other central market, where, years ago, after she had ordered 20 pounds of raspberries and currants for making jelly, she was invited by the wholesale fruit dealer, Mr. Lebrano, aged 29, to spend a holiday with him in the charming southern city whose Mediterranean Baroque churches he described with much delicacy of feeling. Miss Easling was too startled to reply. Mistaking her silence, Mr. Lebrano then mentioned a northern city containing a Gothic cathedral. Mrs. Easling said that such a holiday was impossible. Mr. Lebrano asked for one good reason. Mrs. Easling was at that moment 4 months pregnant with her second child. 3 stepchildren waited for her out in the street. A 4th stepchild was at home, looking after the baby. Professor Easling worked on his mail branch of money. Was at home, too, expecting his lunch. Miss Easling realized that she could not give Mr. Lebrano one good reason. She left the cold storage room without another word, and did not return to it in her lifetime. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Miss Easling would like to be received by the professor's gratitude. Having lived an exemplary life is one thing. To have it thrown up at one is another. She would like the police to send for Professor Easling and tell him so. She suggests that the police find some method of keeping him off the streets. The police ought to threaten him, frighten him, put the fear of the devil into him. Philosophy has made him afraid of dying. Remind him of how he avoided riding his Malebranche mortality. He is an old man. It should be easy. All right. Well, I know I fumbled it like 100,000 times, but either way, I love that story. I'm going to just give a brief description of what I think it's about, or how I approach the reading of it. Is just, to me, it just feels like kind of a satire on heaven. Mavis was a cradle Catholic. She was raised Catholic. So it definitely feels very Catholic in a sense, like this whole idea of like a bureaucratic heaven would definitely be within our realm. You know, just the idea that we're never going to slip this amount of bureaucracy or this amount of like organization that's already within the world, that it's in the afterlife as well. Things don't really get better. They're just kind of the same, just in another world. This poor guy, Francis Carnes, he just wants to be left alone. He just wants to receive his blood of Christ and his body of Christ and just get on with his day. And all these living just continue to bother him. I especially love the part where he says that they disgust him. I just think it's so funny, the idea of a spirit being disgusted by human beings. Either way, I'd like to see what any and everyone thinks of this story. If you've read it before and you have any opinions, I always like to hear new takes on everything, especially stories that I've been reading for a long time. So please feel free to leave anything in the comment section, and thank you very much for watching.